Good morning. We are filming today from the Boston Book Fair 2011 at the Heinz Auditorium. All the interviews today will be coming from that spot. And our first interview today is Ed Pollack. Ed, good to see you. Could you tell us a little bit about what your background is, family, schools, where you grew up, etc.?
Sure. I'm originally from New York City, and I went to public schools in New York and later in Westchester County. And then I went to Hobart College in Geneva, New York, and to the law school at Harvard. And I practiced as a lawyer from about 1961, after I finished being in the Army, until 1996. I worked for many years for the U.S. government, for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and then subsequently I was the general counsel for the Massachusetts Housing Finance Agency. That's my background, I guess.
What about your parents?
My parents were from New York City. My father had been born in Scotland and brought to this country as an infant. He was born, I think, while his parents were in the process of emigrating. And my father was a salesman for Coro, which was a leading maker of women's costume jewelry. And my mom was a housewife, mother. Yeah.
Siblings?
I have a brother who lives in California, and a sister who lives in New Jersey, and I'm the eldest.
You're the eldest of the three. Okay. When did you get bitten by the book bug?
Yes. When I lived in New York in the 1960s, and I was at that time already working for Department of HUD, I lived in a building which had a passageway through from the street to a building in the rear, and I lived in the rear building. And the same people also owned the adjoining building. So they didn't use the passageway, they used an entrance through the main building. The building was sold, and the new owners put doors at either end of the passageway and put a for rent sign on it. So with a couple of friends, we rented that space. It was 6 feet wide and 60 feet long.
Wow.
And we had basically an antique shop there that we called the Tunnel of Love because of the length and narrowness of it. And in the course of buying things for that shop, and I would occasionally buy a book. We were very interested at that time in Art Nouveau. Mm. And I remember buying books by Will Bradley. We had Fringilla and a few others, but we were primarily an antique shop, and we had it for a couple of years, and finally decided we needed to give it up. It wasn't really working.
What year was it?
This was 1966, 67, 68, I think.
While you were still working for
Oh, yes.
Don't want to leave that big job.
No. So that was my first introduction to buying and selling books at that time. And when we closed that store, I had a couple of boxes of interesting books, and they sat with me for a while. And then in 1970, I moved to Boston. As a result of a reorganization of the government, my job moved, and I moved. And again there, not having learned my lesson from the first store, I got involved in another one with some people. And so I started to, I put out those boxes of books, and people actually were buying them.
Wow. Which
incentivized me to go out and buy more, which I did, and suddenly there were shelves and shelves full of books in there. And again, it was not a successful shop, and again I was left with lots of boxes of books this time. So I started to go to the Mass Rhode Island book shows, and I started to look at what was there, and I said, stuff I have is on a par with a lot of what I'm seeing here. And one thing and another, I joined Marriott, exhibited at their book fairs, and so that was how I got into it as a book dealer.
Where was your shop in Boston?
It was on Charles Street.
Really?
Yep.
Down which side of Charles? The
It was on that main side of Charles Street where used to be a lot of antique shops and things. Yeah. It was, our store there was called All Our Yesterdays. Yeah. We had it for a few years in the, I think from maybe 1979 to 1984, 5.
When did you move up to Portland?
I moved to Portland 5 years ago.
Where were you in between the Boston shop and Portland?
Oh, well, I lived in Boston from 1970 to 2000. And I had a really beautiful condominium on Beacon Street that I had bought when I had bought a one-bedroom unit when condominiums were first coming in Massachusetts. And a few years after I bought it, my neighbor wanted to sell his, and I was able to buy that and open it into what essentially was the parlor floor of a 19th century townhouse. So it was a beautiful space, and I retired from Mass Housing Finance Agency in 1996. And I started to think about, well, you know, now I'm a full-time book dealer, but I'm not really making a whole lot of money at it. I have a pension. The condo fees and the real estate taxes keep escalating. Maybe I should cash this out and live somewhere else, which I did. And I moved to Cape Cod.
I remember that.
And I was down on the Cape for 6 or 7 years. But I'm a city person, and it really wasn't a pleasing milieu to me. And I started to do some business with a woman who had an art gallery up in Portland. And I would go up there periodically, and I've known the city since I was a teenager, because I was a summer camper and later a counselor. And we used to go into Portland. And so I was talking to her one day and saying she had moved her gallery from Bangor, Maine, down to Portland, and I was congratulating her that it was a good decision, etc. So, well, if you like it so much, you can have an art gallery of your own. There's a space about to be vacant a few doors away. And I laughed it off, but on my way back home, I said, well, maybe this is something I should do. It'd be my ticket off of Cape Cod back to a city. And so I did. And that's how I came to move to Portland, and that was in 2007.
When did you start getting involved with prints and that kind of stuff? I mean, you're a bookseller, but you're also a print dealer.
Yes, and I can tell you about that. Way back in the 60s, when I was still living in New York and working for the government, a man moved into the office next to mine. He hung pictures up all around the walls of the office. And I went in, I passed by, saw all these things. I went in and I said, oh, how nice, what is this? And anyone who collects art, or anyone who collects books, or who collects anything, I guess, if you show the least bit of interest in what it is that they do, they want to tell you as much as you're willing to listen to. So. Next thing I knew, I had an invitation out to dinner at his house, and the apartment was just hung with all sorts of wonderful things, mostly German expressionist prints. That was what he and his wife collected. And before the evening ended, I had bought a picture off of the wall. It was affordable for me at the time, though it was significant money. It was $125. This was 1964, maybe, or 5.
That was some money then.
Yeah, and but it was an Otto Dix etching from a series called Circus. It's called Suleika the Tattooed Lady. And its present value is more than 100 times what I paid for it.
Wow.
And I still own it, and I guess I always will, because it was really the first piece of art that I ever bought. Yeah.
Wow.
And over the years following that, I always would occasionally buy a picture. I mean, if I had money, I would buy pictures. So I had a small collection. When I sold the apartment in Boston, I had money to spend, and I started to get involved in prints in a much bigger way. I was buying at the auction and buying where I could find them. And, what I also found is I would do the book shows, and I would bring out some pictures to the shows, and I was selling the pictures better than I was selling the books, so that further incentivized me. Am I all right?
No, you're fine. Keep going.
That further incentivized me to get into it. Meanwhile, with the coming of the internet into the book world, that whole dynamic changed, and it changed very much for me because my specializations, which were children's books and art monographs, books about art and artists, books about photographers and photography, were the areas of specialization. And as you undoubtedly know, a lot of that material, which we used to think was reasonably scarce or even rare, if you brought it out to a book show, it might be the only one. Once it was online, there'd be numerous copies. It had a negative effect on values and on desirability and interest, and so that more and more I felt like moving away from the books and into the art was working for me, and so that has continued. And at this point, I consider myself more of an art dealer than a book dealer, but only because it just has worked out that way. Well, for one thing, my whatever you want to call it, passion or interest or whatever, is more toward the artwork, and the economics, I think, are more favorable for me there. So that's that story. Yeah.
What about Ed? What about the internet? You mentioned it just briefly with the race to the bottom, so to speak. How did you find yourself when the internet started to become a factor? Was it an easy transition, a difficult transition? Are you a bookseller who uses an internet, or are you an internet person who became a bookseller?
No, I'm a bookseller who uses the internet. Right. It was in the early 90s, I think. I was set up at a book show in New Hampshire near Gary, Austin. And Gary was already using the internet at that time, and he had a laptop with him, and he was showing me all this. I said, well, and I always say to people, Gary was my mentor as far as getting involved in selling books in the modern way, and so it is, and I still sell. I list on a number of the sites, and I sell books. So, I mean, they can be $10 and $15 and $20 books, but I sell them. And just this week, I got a very substantial, out of the blue, bizarre order for a very expensive item from one of the book sites. So I still, and it's one of those items that I don't know whether we should call it a book or whether we should call it an artwork. It's one of those kinds of things. But I do list all my art inventory along with the book inventory, and interestingly enough, I do sell art stuff through the book sites.
When you first started selling books and prints, etc., were there any particular dealers who made a strong influence for you, or were sort of may have been mentors, or
Well,
somebody you looked up to as an expert?
Yes, certainly. I worked downtown, and I used to spend my lunch hours at Goodspeed's and at the Brattle. And,
where else?
Yeah, and so certainly first George and later Kenny, and of course Arnold Silverman at Goodspeed's. What?
Arnold Silverman down at Milk Street.
Yep. And that was where I did my my daily book buying. And my other technique of buying books was get in the car on the weekends. My mom was alive at that time, and she was living with me because she was elderly. And I said, "Come on, let's go somewhere." And I found out why they call Boston the hub, because you can take a 2 or 3 hour day trip
anyway.
in any number of directions in 5 or 6 different states. And in those early days when there were bookstores, you could come back with a carload of interesting material, and you could buy books that were in your field of interest at prices that you could earn some money on because they weren't in the field of interest of the person who was selling them, and there wasn't the instant ability to find out what is this book worth. You had to guess at it or use your experience or whatever to come up with that.
Today we have the so-called instant expert. They get on the internet and they copy somebody's description.
Yep.
Whether their condition of their book is the same or not is irrelevant to them.
That's right.
And there you have it. They use everybody else's knowledge except their own.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the horrors of the book of the internet.
Well, it's been a mixed blessing. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you're able to reach people you maybe never have been able to reach otherwise.
And that is true. I mean, I do get orders internationally, and it's just been very expanding in many ways. And but it's also it's changed the dynamic of the business immensely. Yeah.
Do you operate an open shop?
I have an open shop. When I first had it, I'm in my second space in Portland. The first space was a art gallery and bookshop, and I had most of my book inventory was there, but nobody would buy it. And when I moved to the second space, I said, I'm just going to have this as a pristine-looking, open art gallery space. And I took the books home and set up a shelving system down in my basement, because almost all of my sales are internet sales now, except if I take things to show. I found I couldn't sell them out of the shop, which is the reason there are no more open bookshops. People don't buy that way.
No.
They use it as a reference tool to see what you have and what you price it at, and then they go and buy it on the internet.
It's only the old timers like us who remember when they were dotted all over the New England.
Oh, yeah.
You couldn't spit without hitting a bookseller.
That's right.
It's not a bad thing to do either.
Yeah.
What percentage of your business comes from book fairs, from the internet, from any other source of
well, I wish I could tell you, but I don't keep records that way. Yes,
some mental approximation.
I have my own website, which I get some really good business off of. That almost is always art business, though. I do. The Boston Book Fair is the only ABAA show I do now. I did try New York. I tried California back when I first became an ABAA member. The costs of doing it were kind of prohibitive against what I was getting back, and I stopped doing them. I've done an occasional regional book show, though those keep shrinking and diminishing, and I don't know if they're going to last. But I also do several print shows during the year. So if I take my book and print shows together, I'd say they probably account for a third of my business. The internet maybe another third, and my website probably. I mean, that's
it's a
about
fairly even
what I
split
can
in your
say.
head.
I've never really tried to determine which is working better than what, but it would probably be a smart thing to do and then focus that, but I just haven't. I'm just guessing at that distribution.
We used to tell young booksellers that they ought to have a business plan and they ought to have a budget, but I don't know too many of us who have a business plan and who have a budget. My budget is when I have money, I buy books, and when I don't have money, I still buy books.
Yeah.
And hope for the best.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about if you were entering the trade today, would you, and how would you do it?
I don't know that I can contribute very much on that, I have to say. I didn't enter this trade deliberately. It just sort of happened to me. And so I don't really feel that, other than saying to people, if you think this is something you'd like to do, go ahead and do it. I don't know what I would say, honestly, and rather than sit here and try to spin something, I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think some of the great challenges facing the antiquarian book trade today?
Well, I think we have a less and less well-educated populace that's less and less aware, let alone interested in, the kinds of things that traditionally have been the things that educated people like. I'm finding this with both books and with the artwork that there's not a lot. I mean, I know I went to college and grad school, and I came out of there and I knew certain things, and I'm finding that people with that level of education don't know those things. I'm not saying I think they're stupid or that they're badly educated, but they're being educated in different things. And so I think all of that taken together, of course, with the technology, which is changing even what books are, and even what art is, because honestly, I meet people now who think if they have an iPhone and Photoshop that they are photographers. and they come to me in the gallery, well, would you show my work, And what I'm saying is I'm not so sure that we're not headed in a direction where people are going to be their own artists, as opposed to needing to buy art from people who are accredited or whatever as artists, who have studied and who are producing art with a certain aesthetic and a certain technical level of skill. They can produce a perfectly nice-looking picture and hang it up in their house. And there are now computer programs which enable you to paint and da-da-da-da. So I'm not sure that there's the same kind of future for either books or art or anything that there was back 50 or 75 or 100 years ago as things that people felt had value and wanted to own. So I do see that there's a lot of change coming. Some of it is technological. Some of it is a result of different kinds of education. And some of it is the result of a general dumbing down of aesthetics. Yeah.
Next question is a two-part question. Part A, who do you think are some of the great booksellers that we are currently working with these days? And part B, who are some of the young booksellers who you think are going to be the future of our trade?
Well, I think the answer to both of those questions is reasonably obvious. Certainly the first one. I'm not. I don't. The great book selling is like what are we talking about when we use that phrase? Because there's so many of us doing so many different things, and they're done on so many different levels. So if you looked at people who are handling the top quality merchandise and selling the expensive books and all of that, well, we know who they are. I don't have to start listing names. But I think also there's just a lot of people doing their own thing with their own specializations. This is another one of those questions I'm not too good at answering.
You don't have to be good at answering any questions. Whatever you say.
But I've met a number of the younger people, and I really like what they're doing. I'm thinking of Alan Zipkin, Brian Cassidy, Brian Bilby, there's one or two others I wanted to mention. Their names are going out of my head. Lauren Bear. The nature of the material that they're handling and the way they're going at it, I think, bodes very well for the future of this business, because they have a sense of what the new culture is that people like us maybe just don't have a clue about, and they come up with great stuff.
Such interesting material.
Yeah. Brian Cassidy has something in his booth that I've been coveting. He had it down in Baltimore too, and it's the poster of Andy Warhol and Jean-Michel Basquiat dressed as boxers. And it's for an exhibition of both of their works, like pitting them against each other. And I had seen this poster before, but his is in absolutely pristine condition. It's
so buy it.
Thing. Yeah, it's a lot of money.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
that's a different story altogether.
I think it's at a level that's beyond me right now. Yeah, but I like it, and I like the fact that he's showing it. And I think that
so lots of different kinds of material these days than what we may have been used to seeing. At a book fair.
Well, one of the things, even there are always these sort of secondary book fairs, which are books, ephemera, postcards, blah blah. But even this book fair this weekend, there's a lot of incredibly interesting and wonderful material that are not books.
Right.
And that's why I don't feel uncomfortable bringing the prints that I sell into this book fair. They fall in the same category in a way as the maps and all the various kinds of uncategorizable ephemera that I think some people are selling. But if you say this is a book fair and you look around, if you started to count the objects, I don't know whether it would be, 60%, 70% would be actual books, and the rest would be other things.
Lots of weird things, too.
Which relate, and belong. I don't have any issue about that. But the notion is expanding, and I think that's probably a good idea. Given what the potential future of books might be, it might be a good idea to have some versatility in what it is that we're trying to market.
I see lots of prints, lots of paintings, medicine kits, scales from the Gold Rush era. It's just amazing, and they're not book related. I have one last question for you, Ed, and then I'll let you go. If a young bookseller came to you and said to you, Mr. Pollack, what would your best advice be for me? I'm going into the book trade. I want to be a bookseller. What would be your best piece of advice?
I think probably to find an area within the broader world of books that you really have an interest in, and in terms of knowing about that field and becoming an expert in it, and that will translate into your financial success instead of looking for, how can I make money on this book or something like that. I think being knowledgeable in the area that you choose is probably the primary asset. I think a person's knowledge, expertise, whatever, is their primary asset, and I would advise you to cultivate that.
And Doug Harding, when I asked Doug Harding the question, he said, own your own building.
Oh, there you go.
Which is another good piece of advice. Thanks a lot, Ed. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.